There is a question that most people never ask themselves, and it is the most dangerous question of all. Because if you answer it honestly, it will change everything. And that question is this: are you actually living your life? Or are you just letting it pass by, day after day, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right sign, while the clock keeps moving and your dreams keep getting smaller and smaller until one day you wake up and realize that you traded everything you could have been for the comfort of doing nothing? That is not a small question. That is the question that separates the people who build something real from the people who only talk about it. Welcome to English to Inspire, the channel where every story is a lesson, and every lesson is a chance for you to grow, not only in your English but in your mind, your character, and your understanding of what a human being is truly capable of when they decide to stop making excuses and start taking responsibility for their own life. And if this is your first time here, I want you to take a moment right now to subscribe, because the stories we tell on this channel are not just entertainment. They are fuel, and you are going to need fuel for the journey ahead. Today we are going to talk about a man whose name is known across continents. A man who was born in Bombay in a modest apartment, who watched his father fight for every single rupee, who grew up understanding that the world does not give you anything for free, and who went on to become the richest person in all of Asia. A man who lost half of everything he had, who was laughed at, who was doubted, who watched his own family become his enemy, and who still came back stronger, bigger, and more unstoppable than before. And that man is Mukesh. But here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. Because this story is not really about Mukesh Ambani. This story is about you. It is about the part of you that knows you are capable of more, but keeps finding reasons to stay comfortable. It is about the dream you keep pushing to tomorrow, the business you keep saying you will start next year, the life you keep promising yourself you will build one day. And the reason I am telling you Mukesh Ambani's story is because his life is proof, real proof, not theory, not motivation talk, but actual living proof, that the distance between where you are and where you want to be is not talent. It is not money. It is not luck. It is decision. Mukesh Ambani was not born with a guarantee. He was not handed a crown. He was handed a lesson, a living, breathing lesson from a father who had nothing and refused to stay that way. And that lesson began in one of the most electric, chaotic, and beautiful cities in the world, in Bombay, in a small apartment, in a family where ambition was not a luxury. It was a survival skill. And it is in that city, in that home, with that father, that everything begins. Dhirubhai Ambani was not a businessman in the traditional sense. He was a force of nature, a man who grew up so poor that he sold fritters on the street as a teenager just to earn a few coins. A man who worked as a gas station attendant in Yemen in his early 20s, with nothing in his pocket but a fire in his chest that refused to go out. A man who came back to India with almost no money, started a small textile trading company, and through sheer will, sheer hunger, and a mind that could see opportunities where other people only saw obstacles, built one of the most powerful business empires the world had ever seen. And it was into this man's home, into this man's energy, into this man's story, that Mukesh Ambani was born on April the 19th in a city that never slept and never apologized for its chaos. Growing up, Mukesh did not live in a mansion. He did not have a swimming pool or a private driver waiting outside the door every morning. The family lived in a modest apartment in Bhuleshwar, a dense and busy neighborhood in the heart of Bombay, and Mukesh shared that space with his parents, his siblings, and the constant presence of his father's ambition, which filled every room like electricity. And what is remarkable about this is that Dhirubhai never hid the struggle from his children. He never pretended that success was easy or that money came without sacrifice. Instead, he let them see the work. He let them see the late nights and the early mornings, the negotiations, the risks, the moments of doubt, and the moments of triumph, because he understood something that most parents do not. that the greatest education you can give a child is not found in a textbook. It is found in watching someone they love refuse to quit. Mukesh was a quiet child, thoughtful and observant, the kind of boy who listened more than he spoke, who sat at the dinner table and absorbed every word his father said about business, about people, about the way the world worked. And those early conversations shaped something deep inside him, a belief that scale was not just possible but necessary, that if you were going to build something, you should build it so big that it cannot be ignored, so solid that it cannot be broken, and so useful that people cannot imagine their lives without it. And this was not a philosophy he read in a book. This was a philosophy he learned by watching his father negotiate deals in a tiny office and dream out loud about changing the face of Indian industry. Dhirubhai had a saying that Mukesh carried with him for the rest of his life, and it was this: think big, think fast, think ahead. And those three ideas, scale, speed, and vision, became the foundation on which Mukesh would eventually build everything. But before he could build anything, he had to learn. He had to study. He had to sit inside classrooms and laboratories and understand the technical language of the industries his father was conquering. And so Mukesh moved through his education with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything, attending Hill Grange High School, then St. Xavier's College, and eventually the University Department of Chemical Technology in Bombay, where he studied chemical engineering and began to understand not just the business of industry, but the actual physical science behind it. And this is something I want you to think about right now, because it is easy to look at a man like Mukesh Ambani today, standing at the top of $100 billion empire, and assume that he was simply born into success, that the path was clear and the doors were open and the money was already there waiting for him. But that is not the truth. The truth is that he was a young man sitting in a classroom, studying hard, carrying the weight of a father's enormous dream on his shoulders, trying to become worthy of the opportunity that was being created around him. And he did not waste that time. He used every single day to become more. And now the question is whether you are doing the same with yours. There is a moment in every young person's life when the world opens up in front of them like a map with no borders, when possibilities feel infinite and the future feels like something you can reach out and touch with your bare hands. And for Mukesh Ambani, that moment came when he boarded a flight to the United States of America and arrived at Stanford University in California, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, a place where the smartest and most ambitious young minds gathered to study, to compete, to dream, and to prepare themselves for lives of impact. And Mukesh arrived there with everything he needed to succeed: a sharp mind, a disciplined work ethic, a father's fire burning inside him, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you are willing to do to get where you want to go. Stanford was everything you would expect it to be: intellectually demanding, culturally electric, and full of people who were hungry in the same way Mukesh was hungry. And he was pursuing his MBA. They're studying business at one of the highest levels possible, absorbing ideas about leadership and strategy in markets that would have taken decades to learn through experience alone. And in another life, in a different story, Mukesh might have stayed there, graduated, taken a comfortable job in America, built a comfortable life, and the world would never have known what it lost. But life does not always follow the plan you write for yourself. And in 1981, just 1 year into his MBA program, Mukesh received a phone call from his father, and that phone call changed everything. Dhirubhai needed him, not in a year, not after graduation, but now, because Reliance was at a critical point, growing faster than its own infrastructure could support, expanding into new industries, fighting political battles, managing a workforce that was multiplying by the month. And Dhirubhai understood something that no university professor had ever taught. He understood that the most important education his son could receive was not in a lecture hall in California, but on the ground in India. inside the actual machinery of the business, making real decisions with real consequences in real time. And so Mukesh did something that most people with a Stanford MBA opportunity would never do. He left. He packed his bags. He said goodbye to America. And he came home. And he never looked back. There is an important lesson buried in this moment, and I do not want you to miss it. Because we live in a world that worships credentials. That tells you the degree is the destination. That you are not ready until you have the certificate. The official permission slip that says you are qualified to go out and do the thing you already know how to do. And Mukesh Ambani's decision to leave Stanford is not a lesson against education. It is a lesson about priorities, about knowing when the classroom ends and when real life begins, about understanding that at some point the studying has to stop and the doing has to start. And the people who wait until they feel perfectly prepared are usually the people who never begin at all. When Mukesh returned to India, he did not walk into his father's company as the boss's son and sit in a corner office and wait for reports to land on his desk. He did the opposite. He went to the factory floor. He went to the operational heart of Reliance. He put on his work clothes and stood alongside the engineers and the supervisors and the laborers. And he learned the business, not from the top down, but from the bottom up, because he understood that you cannot lead what you do not understand. You cannot manage what you have never touched. And you cannot earn the respect of the people who do the hard work every day if you have never been willing to do the hard work yourself. And that decision, that choice to start at the bottom, even when he did not have to, was the beginning of something that would eventually shake an entire nation. The Patalganga petrochemical complex was not a glamorous place. It was not the kind of location that appeared in magazines or impressed dinner guests. It was a massive industrial site about 60 kilometers southeast of Bombay, full of pipes and pressure valves and chemical reactors and thousands of workers who started before sunrise and finished long after dark. And this is where Mukesh Ambani came to learn, not as a visitor, not as an observer, but as a working member of the operation, a young man in his mid-20s, who happened to be the chairman's son, but who carried himself like someone who had everything to prove and nothing to take for granted. And the workers noticed this, the engineers noticed this, the supervisors noticed this, and slowly, through the accumulation of hundreds of small moments of showing up and doing the work, Mukesh began to earn something that cannot be bought and cannot be faked. And that thing is respect. He immersed himself in the technical details of polyester manufacturing and petrochemical processing with the same intensity he had brought to his university studies, understanding not just the business logic but the actual science, the actual mechanics, the way materials behaved under heat and pressure, the reasons why certain processes worked and others failed, the relationship between engineering decisions made on the factory floor and financial outcomes, reflected in the company's numbers months later. And this combination of technical knowledge and business instinct made him something rare, the kind of leader who could walk into any room in his organization, whether it was a boardroom or a boiler room, and speak with authority, ask the right questions, and understand the answers. And in a company growing as fast as Reliance was growing, that kind of leader was not just valuable, it was essential. Dhirubhai watched his son during these years with the particular pride of a man who sees his own hunger reflected in someone else's eyes. And he began to give Mukesh more responsibility. Bigger projects, harder problems, and Mukesh took each one with the same quiet seriousness, treating every challenge as a classroom, every failure as a data point, every success as a reason to aim higher. And one of the most defining projects of this period was the expansion of the Patalganga facility itself, a massive undertaking that required coordinating thousands of workers, managing complex supply chains, negotiating with government bodies, and making engineering decisions worth hundreds of millions of rupees. And Mukesh led this expansion with a precision and a vision that surprised even the people who already believed in him. What I want you to understand about this period of Mukesh's life is that it was not exciting in the way that people want their success stories to be exciting. There were no viral moments, no headlines, no standing ovations. It was just years and years of hard, unglamorous, disciplined work inside a factory, learning things that most wealthy young men in his position would never have bothered to learn. And that is exactly why it matters. Because the world is full of people who want the result but are not willing to sit inside the process. People who want the empire but refuse to spend time on the factory floor. People who want the respect of their team but will not do the work that earns that respect. And Mukesh understood, at a very young age, that there are no shortcuts to genuine competence. That you either know your business or you do not. And the only way to truly know it is to live inside it. By the time Mukesh was in his early 30s, Reliance was no longer just a textile company. It had grown into one of the most powerful conglomerates in India, moving aggressively into refining and manufacturing. And Mukesh was no longer just Dhirubhai's son. He was a force in his own right. A man who had earned his place, not through inheritance, but through years of relentless learning and relentless work. And the business world was beginning to take notice. And yet, even as Reliance grew and the family's wealth multiplied and the future looked brighter than ever, something was quietly moving toward them. Something that none of them could stop. Something that would test everything Mukesh had built inside himself during all those years on the factory floor. And that something was loss. On the 6th of July, 2002, Dhirubhai Ambani suffered a massive stroke and was rushed to the Breach Candy Hospital in Bombay. And for 2 weeks, the entire nation held its breath, because Dhirubhai was not just a businessman, he was a symbol. A living proof that an ordinary Indian man with no connections and no capital could build something extraordinary through nothing but will and vision. And when he died on the 6th of July, 2002, the grief that swept across India was the kind of grief that people feel when they lose not just a person but an idea. And for Mukesh and his brother Anil, the grief was deeper than anything the public could see, because they had not just lost a father, they had lost the man who was the center of everything. The man who had held the family and the empire together by the sheer force of his personality. And now he was gone, and he had left no will. Those 2 words, no will, do not sound like much until you understand what they mean in the context of a company worth billions of rupees, with 2 ambitious sons who had spent their entire adult lives inside it. And what they mean is that there was no document, no legal instruction, no written record of how Dhirubhai wanted his empire divided. And into that silence rushed everything that money and grief and ego and years of unspoken rivalry can produce. And the world watched as the Ambani family, one of the most celebrated dynasties in Indian business history, began to tear itself apart in public, with accusations flying in newspapers, lawyers filing motions in courts, and 2 brothers who had grown up in the same small apartment in Bhuleshwar, now standing on opposite sides of a line that was growing wider every day. The formal split came in 2005, when their mother Kokalaben intervened and brokered a division of the empire. Mukesh took Reliance Industries, which included the core petrochemical, refining, and manufacturing businesses, while Anil received the telecom, entertainment, and financial services arms under a new entity called Reliance Anil Dhirubhai Ambani Group. And on paper this looked like a clean resolution. 2 brothers, 2 empires, a family moving forward. But the reality was messier and more painful than any press release could capture. Because this was not just a business separation, it was a family fracture. And the wounds that opened during those years did not close quickly. And the non-compete agreements, and legal disputes, and public statements continued to create friction. Long after the formal division was complete. I want to stop here for a moment and speak directly to you. Because there is something in this chapter of Mukesh's story that goes far beyond business. Something deeply human. Something that many of you listening right now will recognize from your own life. Because most of us have experienced some version of this. Not necessarily at this scale. Not with billions of rupees at stake. But the essential experience of losing something or someone that was the foundation of everything you built, and finding yourself suddenly standing in the middle of what used to be solid ground and realizing that the ground is no longer there. And the question that moment asks you is not a business question. It is a character question. And that question is this: who are you when everything falls apart? What do you do when the structure that held you up is suddenly gone? Do you collapse? Do you blame? Do you walk away? Or do you build again? Mukesh chose to build again, and he did not do it loudly. He did not give dramatic speeches or make grand announcements about his comeback. He did what he had always done. He went back to work. He went back to the details. He went back to the factory floor mentality that his father had given him all those years ago in and he looked at what he had, which was Reliance Industries, a powerful but wounded company in need of direction and vision. And he began to think not about what had been lost, but about what could be built. And the scale of what he was about to build was so enormous, so audacious, so far beyond what anyone expected from a man who had just survived a public family war, that when people finally saw it, they could not quite believe it was real. There is a particular kind of strength that only becomes visible after a person has been broken. Not the strength that comes from never being tested. Not the confidence of someone who has always had everything go their way, but the deeper, quieter, more dangerous strength of someone who has stood in the wreckage of something they loved and decided to build again anyway. And this was the strength that Mukesh Ambani carried into the next chapter of his life. A chapter defined not by grief or rivalry or legal battles, but by one of the most ambitious industrial undertakings in the history of the modern world. Because Mukesh looked at Reliance Industries, assessed what he had, assessed what the world needed, and made a decision that most businessmen would have considered reckless. He decided to build the largest oil refining complex on the planet, and he decided to build it in Jamnagar, a coastal city in the state of Gujarat, in the middle of what was essentially empty land. And he decided to do it faster and bigger than anyone thought possible. The Jamnagar refinery project was not just an engineering challenge. It was a statement, a declaration to the world that Reliance Industries was not a wounded company licking its wounds after a family dispute. It was a machine in motion, a vision in progress. And Mukesh drove it with the same hands-on intensity he had brought to the Patalganga factory floor 2 decades earlier. Except now the scale was incomprehensibly larger, with hundreds of thousands of workers at peak construction, with equipment being shipped from dozens of countries, with technical problems being solved in real time that had never been solved before at this level of complexity. And what emerged from that land in Gujarat was nothing short of extraordinary. A refinery complex capable of processing more than 1 million barrels of crude oil per day, the largest and most complex refining hub in the entire world. And it did not just process oil, it processed doubt. It processed every whisper that said Mukesh was finished, every analyst who underestimated him, every competitor who thought the family split had permanently weakened him. But Mukesh understood something about large-scale success that most people miss entirely, and it is this: a single great achievement, no matter how enormous, is never the destination. It is always the foundation. And the moment the Jamnagar refinery was operating, and the world was paying attention, Mukesh was already thinking about the next thing, already studying the next industry, already asking the question that defined his entire career, which was not how do I protect what I have built, but how do I build something that makes everything I have built before look small. And this relentless forward momentum, this refusal to treat any success as a finishing line, was what separated Mukesh Ambani from businessmen who build one great thing and spend the rest of their lives defending it. Reliance Industries under Mukesh's leadership expanded with a systematic aggression that looked almost geometric in its logic, moving from petrochemicals into retail, from retail into telecommunications, from telecommunications into digital services. Each move building on the last, each new business leveraging the infrastructure and the relationships and the scale of everything that came before it. And the internal culture he built inside the company reflected his own personality. Disciplined, detail-oriented, long-term in its thinking, deeply technical in its approach, and completely intolerant of the kind of comfortable mediocrity that settles into large organizations when no one is pushing hard enough. And the people who worked closest to him described a man who asked more questions than he gave answers, who wanted to understand every layer of every problem before he offered a solution, who believed that the person with the deepest knowledge always had the ultimate advantage. And here, I want to challenge you directly. Because the story of the Jamnagar refinery is not really a story about oil or engineering or industrial capacity. It is a story about what a person does with pain. And the pain in Mukesh's case was real and public and humiliating. A family broken apart. A father's legacy turned into a legal dispute. A name that was once synonymous with unity now being discussed in newspapers as a symbol of fracture. And instead of letting that pain make him smaller, instead of retreating into bitterness or spending his energy on revenge, he channeled every single gram of it into building something so undeniable that the world had no choice but to stand up and take notice. And so, I am asking you right now, what are you doing with your pain? Because pain is not just something that happens to you. Pain is raw material, and the only question is whether you are going to waste it or build with it. In 2016, Mukesh Ambani walked onto a stage and announced something that the entire Indian telecommunications industry dismissed almost immediately as impossible, as fantasy, as the kind of grand promise that businessmen make when they want headlines and do not particularly care about reality. And what he announced was Reliance G, a brand new telecommunications network that would offer high-speed 4G data to every Indian citizen at a price so low it was almost free. And the existing telecom companies, the ones who had spent years building their market share and their pricing power and their comfortable profit margins, looked at this announcement and laughed, because they had done the math, or so they thought, and the math said it could not work. The infrastructure cost alone was staggering. The price point was unsustainable, and the idea of connecting over 1 billion people to high-speed internet in a country where hundreds of millions had never used mobile data in their lives was, according to the established players, simply not realistic. Mukesh had been planning Jio for years, quietly, methodically, in the way that he planned everything, with an obsessive attention to detail and a willingness to invest at a scale that made his competitors uncomfortable just to think about. And the total investment in Jio, before it even launched to the public, was approximately $25 billion, which is a number so large that it is almost impossible to hold in your mind. And he spent those years building not just a network, but an ecosystem, laying fiber optic cables across the length and width of India, building data centers, developing a suite of digital applications, manufacturing affordable smartphones to ensure that the price of the device itself would not be a barrier for the hundreds of millions of Indians who had never owned one. Because Mukesh understood that the opportunity was not just to build a telecom company. It was to bring an entire nation online. And the company that brought 1 billion people to the internet would not just be profitable. It would be indispensable. When Jio launched in September of 2016, the response was not gradual. It was a detonation. Millions of Indians signed up in the first weeks, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. And within less than a year, Jio had become the largest mobile network operator in India by subscriber count. And the existing telecom companies were not laughing anymore. They were bleeding. Because Jio had not just entered the market. It had fundamentally rewritten the rules of the market, forcing competitors to slash their own prices, eliminate data charges, and scramble to upgrade their infrastructure just to stay relevant. And several of them never recovered. Some merged, some collapsed entirely. And the Indian telecommunications landscape was permanently and irreversibly transformed by one man's decision to bet everything on a vision that the entire industry had told him was impossible. The deeper lesson of Jio is not about technology, and it is not about money. It is about the relationship between scale and courage. Because the reason most people and most companies never attempt something like Jio is not that they lack the intelligence to imagine it. It is that they lack the courage to commit to it. It is that the size of the investment required to make the vision real is so terrifying that the mind immediately begins to build arguments against it. And those arguments sound reasonable. They sound prudent. They sound like wisdom. But what they really are is fear wearing the costume of logic. And Mukesh Ambani looked at that fear, looked at $25 billion and an industry full of skeptics, and decided that the size of the opposition was not a reason to stop but a signal that the opportunity was real. Because if it were easy, someone else would have already done it. I need you to sit with that idea for a moment, because it applies to your life in a way that is more direct than you might want to admit. Because every time you have looked at something you want to build and told yourself it is too big, too risky, too expensive, too ambitious, too much, what you were really doing was mistaking the size of the challenge for evidence that you should not attempt it, when in reality the size of a challenge is almost always proportional to the size of the reward waiting on the other side of it. And Mukesh Ambani proved that with $25 billion and an idea that an entire industry called impossible. And now, Jio serves hundreds of millions of people every single day and sits at the center of one of the most valuable technology ecosystems in the world. And it all began with one man refusing to let the size of the dream convince him to dream smaller. There is a specific type of businessman who builds one great thing and then spends the rest of his career protecting it, surrounding it with walls, hiring lawyers and lobbyists to keep competitors away, treating his success like a castle under siege rather than a foundation to build upon. And then there is the other type, the rarer type. The type that looks at everything they have built and asks, not how do I protect this, but how do I use this as a launchpad for something even larger. And Mukesh Ambani has never been the first type, not for a single day of his professional life. Because the moment Jio began to reshape Indian telecommunications, he was already thinking about the next layer. Already asking what comes after connectivity, already understanding that giving 1 billion people access to the internet was not the destination but the opening. Move in a strategy so large and so interconnected that most analysts took years to fully understand what they were looking at. The answer to what comes after connectivity was commerce, and the vehicle for that answer was Reliance Retail, which, under Mukesh's direction, grew from a collection of physical stores into the largest retail operation in India. A network of thousands of outlets, spanning everything from groceries to electronics to fashion to pharmaceuticals, serving hundreds of millions of customers across the country. And the genius of the strategy was in the integration, because Reliance Retail was not just a standalone business. It was the physical layer of a digital ecosystem that Jio was building from the ground up. And when Mukesh launched JioMart, an online marketplace that connected local neighborhood stores across India to digital customers, he was not just building an e-commerce platform. He was rewiring the entire supply chain of the Indian consumer economy, connecting the corner shop in a small town to the same digital infrastructure that powered transactions in Mumbai and Delhi and Bangalore. And then came the partnerships. And these were not small partnerships. These were not routine business agreements between companies of similar size. These were strategic alliances with two of the most powerful technology companies in the world. And in 2020, within the space of a few months, Google invested approximately $4.5 billion into Jio platforms, and Facebook invested approximately $5.5 billion. And these investments were not just about capital. They were about validation. They were about two of the most sophisticated technology organizations on the planet looking at what Mukesh had built and deciding that it was not just impressive but indispensable that the digital infrastructure Reliance had constructed in India was so fundamental to the future of one of the world's largest economies that they needed to be part of it. And the message those investments sent to the global business community was heard loudly and clearly. What Mukesh had created by this point was not a company in the traditional sense. It was an ecosystem, a living, interconnected network of businesses that fed each other, that shared infrastructure and data and customer relationships and distribution capabilities, so that the strength of each individual business multiplied the strength of all the others. And this kind of integrated thinking, this ability to see not just one business but the entire architecture of an industry and then build that architecture from scratch, is extraordinarily rare. It requires a mind that can hold enormous complexity without losing clarity, that can think in decades while managing the details of individual days, that can inspire an organization of hundreds of thousands of people to move in the same direction at the same time. And Mukesh had been developing that mind since the days he stood on the factory floor in Patalganga, asking questions that nobody expected the chairman's son to be asking. The empire that Reliance had become by the early 2020s was almost impossible to summarize in simple terms. because it touched almost every aspect of Indian economic life. From the fuel in your car, to the fabric of your shirt, to the data on your phone, to the groceries in your kitchen, to the movies you watched on your television. And beneath all of it was the same philosophy that Dhirubhai had whispered across a dinner table in a small Bombay apartment decades earlier. Think big, think fast, think ahead. And what Mukesh had done was take that philosophy and apply it at a scale his father could only have dreamed of, building not just a business but a permanent, structural part of the Indian economy. And in doing so, he had answered every critic, healed every wound, and silenced every voice that had ever suggested the family split would be the end of his story. Because it was not the end. It was not even close to the end. It was simply the moment the real story began. Mukesh Ambani does not talk the way most billionaires talk. He does not fill rooms with the sound of his own voice. He does not give interviews designed to make himself sound visionary or profound. He does not spend his time building a personal brand on social media or chasing the kind of celebrity that some wealthy men confuse with significance. And this silence, this deliberate quietness, is itself a philosophy. A way of saying that the work is the statement and the results are the speech, and that a man who is truly building something real does not need to constantly tell the world that he is building it, because the world will eventually be unable to avoid seeing it. And this philosophy of letting the work speak is something Mukesh absorbed from his father and then refined into something uniquely his own. Over 50 years of watching, learning, building, losing, and building again. One of the most consistent threads running through Mukesh Ambani's thinking is his belief in India itself. Not as a sentimental idea or a patriotic slogan, but as a genuine, data-driven, long-term investment thesis. A belief that a country of 1.4 billion people with a young population, a growing middle class, an expanding digital infrastructure, and a cultural hunger for progress represented the single greatest economic opportunity in the world. And while other global investors were cautious about India, citing bureaucracy and infrastructure gaps and regulatory complexity, Mukesh was moving in the opposite direction, doubling down, investing deeper, building longer, because he understood that the very friction that scared other investors away was what made the opportunity so large. Because if India were easy, everyone would already be there, and the prize would already be gone. His approach to time is something that separates him from almost every other businessman operating at his level. Because most people in positions of power think in quarters, in annual reports, in election cycles, in the short windows that financial markets use to measure success and failure, and Mukesh thinks in decades. He makes decisions today that are designed to pay off, not in the next earnings call, but in the next generation. And this long-term orientation requires a particular kind of patience that is almost uncomfortable to observe in a world that rewards speed and punishes stillness, because it means accepting years of investment without visible return, years of building infrastructure that has no immediate revenue, years of being misunderstood by analysts who cannot see past the next 12 months. And Mukesh has done this repeatedly, with Geo, with retail, with digital services, absorbing the short-term criticism in exchange for the long-term transformation. He also has an almost obsessive belief in the power of scale. Not scale as a vanity metric, not bigness for the sake of bigness, but scale as a fundamental competitive advantage. The understanding that a business operating at sufficient size can do things that smaller competitors simply cannot do, can absorb costs that would destroy others, can invest in infrastructure that takes years to pay off, can offer prices that make it impossible for anyone else to compete. And this belief in scale is why Reliance has never been content to be the second largest anything. Why every business Mukesh has entered has been pursued with the intention of becoming the dominant player. Not through aggression for its own sake, but through the simple logic that if you are going to spend decades building something, you should build it to win. And perhaps the deepest and most transferable lesson in Mukesh Ambani's philosophy is his relationship with failure and fracture. Because he has experienced both at levels most people will never come close to. He lost his father, He lost half his family's empire. He watched his name become a symbol of conflict. He launched businesses that analysts called delusional. And through all of it, he maintained the same fundamental orientation, which was forward, always forward, never spending more time looking at what was broken than was necessary to understand how to fix it. And this is not a natural human response. The natural human response to loss is to stop, to grieve, to protect, to shrink. And Mukesh consciously and repeatedly chose the opposite. And that choice, made again and again across decades of a life lived at the highest possible stakes, is the real lesson. The lesson that no university teaches and no book fully captures. The lesson that the direction you choose after the fall determines everything that comes after it. And the most important chapter of your story is always the one you write after the worst thing has already happened. We have traveled a long way together in this story. From a small apartment in Bombay where a boy watched his father dream out loud, to a factory floor in Patalganga where a young man chose to learn instead of inherit, to the wreckage of a family split apart by grief and money and silence, to a refinery rising out of empty land in Gujarat that became the largest in the world, to a stage in 2016 where one man stood in front of an industry full of skeptics and announced something they all said was impossible, and then proceeded to make it inevitable. And now we are here, at the end of this story, or rather at the beginning of yours, because everything you have heard today was never really about Mukesh Ambani. It was always about you. It was always about the conversation happening right now between this story and whatever is living unfinished inside you. So let me ask you the question that this entire story has been building toward, and I want you to answer it honestly, not to me, but to yourself. In the quiet space behind your own eyes, where nobody else can hear you, and where the only voice that matters is the one that already knows the truth. And the question is this: what is your GO moment? What is the thing you have been carrying around in your mind for months or years? The idea you keep returning to, the business you keep sketching out on paper and then folding up and putting in a drawer, the life you keep describing to yourself in the future tense, always saying one day, always saying when the time is right, always finding a new reason why today is not the day. And I want you to understand something with absolute clarity. The time is never going to feel right. The conditions are never going to be perfect. The fear is never going to disappear on its own, because the fear does not go away before you start. The fear only goes away because you start. Mukesh Ambani lost his father, lost half his empire, lost the structure that held his entire world together. And he did not wait for the pain to stop before he began to build. He built while the pain was still there. He built through the grief and the legal battles and the public humiliation. He built because he understood that waiting for perfect conditions is just a polite way of choosing to stay still. And staying still in a world that is moving this fast, in a world where the distance between a bold decision and a transformed life can be as short as a single committed choice. Staying still is not safety. It is surrender. And you did not come this far in your life to surrender to your own hesitation. Think about the factory floor, because that image matters more than any other image in this entire story. A young man who could have sat in a corner office, who had every excuse to avoid the hard work, who nobody would have judged for choosing comfort over competence, choosing instead to go where it was difficult, choosing to understand the thing from the inside out, choosing to earn the right to lead, rather than simply inheriting the title. And that choice, that single, humble, and ferocious choice, was the root of everything that came after. The refinery, the retail empire, the digital revolution, the $100 billion net worth. All of it grew from the decision of a young man to go to the factory floor when he did not have to. And your factory floor is waiting for you right now. It is the hard thing you have been avoiding. The skill you have been too proud to admit you need to learn. The work you have been doing halfway because doing it fully feels too exposed, too vulnerable, too real. The world does not remember the people who planned carefully and risked nothing and kept themselves safe inside the boundaries of what was already known and already proven. The world remembers the people who saw something that did not yet exist and decided to build it anyway, who absorbed the criticism and the doubt and the laughter of the people who could not see what they could see and kept building, who fell and got up so many times that the falling stopped, meaning anything, because the getting up had become automatic. And Mukesh Ambani is one of those people. And the only question that remains, the only question that has ever mattered from the very first word of this story to this very last breath of it, is whether you are going to be one of those people too. Because the clock is running, the opportunity is real, and the only thing standing between the life you have and the life you are capable of is the decision you make in the next moment. So make it. Go to your factory floor. Start building. The world is waiting, and it has waited long enough.